Hello, RoahmMythril here once again, getting back to RoahmMythrill 3, and it's time for the judge commentary for the last two stages we just went through. So yes, our start into Tier 2. Starting with 165th place, we have Damp Ruins by Laser Chicken. I still love that name. 30.9 out of 100, this stage had 13.4 in design, 8.2 in fun, 5.4 in creativity, 7.2 in aesthetics, and 7 in functionality with a 25% time penalty. Mick, 41 out of 100. Wow, this ended as soon as it started. While it has a good selection of pieces, the end result doesn't capitalize on any of it. Of particular note are Karakari, Shaboan, and Ace Manbo. Karakari only appears once and only barely does anything. Ace Manbo never gets to do anything unless you don't drop straight down, and Shaboan only really matters when it spawns right next to you. There are moments I enjoyed. The You're in a Small Room and Knuckle Dusters layout come to mind. And I will grant, I don't know if I've seen powered-up geysers and Uranus blocks combined before, offering some creativity. Otherwise, this feels unfinished, especially with torches and pools that don't animate, and overall doesn't give me a whole lot to work with. It has more interesting stuff than the usual Mets and shows, but there's not enough going on to be anything other than lackluster. I wish this level tried to do more. Shinryu, 23 out of 100. If there's anything I can say in favor of this stage, it's that the combination of the rotating platforms and water jets is a neat idea. While it's not used anywhere close to its fullest potential here, I think it could work if there was more done with it. Other than that, there's not a whole lot going on here. Even with the use of the rotating platforms everywhere, this stage still feels really basic. There's very few instances where the gimmicks are taken advantage of to make things engaging, with the first token being one of the only examples. What really hurts is that it's easy to see how it could have been improved. Some of the enemies, especially the Morning Joes, would be far more threatening if they were placed in a way that forced you to interact with the platforms and water jets in some way, either by avoiding them or getting to a certain height to actually hit them. The only ones that offer any kind of engagement are the Moles, which only show up for that one token room. So yeah, it kinda seems like that was a bit of a highlight for the judges so far. That aside, the last notable thing about this level is that there's no checkpoints until the boss corridor. Oh wow, yeah, that's right. I don't think I noticed that. Honestly though, given how short and easy this stage is, that doesn't really have as much of an impact here as it would in almost any other given level. I still wouldn't necessarily call that a good thing though. All that being said, I'd still love to see a more well-realized version of this stage. There's a lot of potential in the two chosen gimmicks here, it just needs to be fleshed out over the course of a full level is all. Patchy, 64 out of 100. Damped and compact. It's a fine stage, it's just kind of a bit too short. Really solid choices of gimmicks. I really like some of the setups here, like the water pump sending the player straight through the rotating platform, and the part where you need to descend through the platforms while dodging moles. 3 out of 5. The aesthetics here are also pretty unique. Pharaohman and Pumpman tile sets together isn't something you see every day, yet they blend quite nicely. Mega Mech Shark as the end boss seems rather unfitting. It seems like he's there to pad out the playtime a bit because the fight takes almost as long as going through the stage alone, if you try to only buster it anyway. Yeah, I never liked buster-onlying the middle section. The rest isn't that bad, but that middle section. Tornado blow all the way. This is probably someone's first stage, and it's quite a good start if it is. I can see the potential of a good level designer here, so do keep at it. Flashman 85, 44 out of 100. We need to talk about playtesting because the room before the boss cost you about 25% of the score I was going to give. Until the dev team intervened, it was physically impossible to enter the boss chamber. If you die at the boss, you're taken back to a checkpoint in the ceiling where you'll be stuck forever. Don't let your level be ruined by incredibly avoidable boo-boos. Aside from being unbeatable, the level is inoffensive. The best and worst parts are equally mild. I dig the atmosphere. Water plus ruins is a pleasant combination, and the music choice sets it off nicely. Some animation, torches especially, would be even better. Fixing the suspicious collision-free ceiling would be good. Despite a slight gradual increase in difficulty, challenges feel underdeveloped. The enemy roster is a bit big for the screen count. Karakari could have had the day off. Water spouts offer possibilities that aren't really explored. It's easy to pick off enemies from a distance before they become a threat. The last vertical area needs work. The sudden absence of water tiles is odd, and there's no clear path to safety. A few descending Uranus platforms would have worked. New elements are introduced gently enough, though most of the early screens have too much going on at once. Graviton challenges are decent. The mini-boss fight is good. The Earnest platforms have their moments. The Mole Mole room, including the tricky token challenge, is easily the highlight of the level. 4 out of 5. Mecha Shark fits thematically, but it needs more spice. Water physics, water spouts, or even just reversing it to fight the head first. Huh, can you actually do that? Or wait, actually come to think of it, is that how the Shark Encounter and Fake Man stage worked? Gods, it's been so long since I've played that. Any tank, or any power-ups at all, would have been appreciated in a level with a multi-phase boss. No middle checkpoint, and effectively no final checkpoint. The level shortness is a boon. The same negatives would outweigh the same positives in a larger level. Ace Spark, 34 out of 100. One of the big takeaways from this level is the combination of the water spouts and the Earnest platforms is a really cool idea, and I just wish that the level had made more use of it. Unfortunately, a lot of the other elements of the level have fairly basic placement and do not offer any sort of meaningful challenge, and the level feels very much like a first draft. This first draft nature extends throughout. The themes within the stage are quite unfocused and unpolished. It is just vaguely watery and somehow temple-y, with assets mixed in such a way that it does not make sense. The level foreground is a good example of having a lack of polish. For one example, if this were an actual location, the bricks the stage is made out of would be staggered and not just stacked atop each other. There are a couple of rooms that stand out as being particularly out of place. The fish drop fell out of nowhere, and the mini-boss had nothing to do with the rest of the stage. The single checkpoint soft blocks the player in the judging build, forcing you to manually quit the stage, and there is one screen transition that can kill the player. Ooh. Wonder which one that was. The mini-boss, which occurs just before the checkpoint, also has instant death involved. I quite like the room with the Earnest platforms and mole enemies. 5 out of 5. Especially the spike drop, which looks dangerous, but the graphics of the Earnest platform allow the player to line up quite nicely. Again, the gimmick combination might have been interesting, but the stage is too short to explore the ideas behind this, which makes the issues stand out more. The sheer brevity of this stage is really the true detriment of this level, as none of its good ideas ever get explored. The fact the Dev Kit boss takes longer than the rest of the stage combined is just the cherry on top. So, yeah, overall this stage, I think the idea is sound, and I definitely agree that there is potential here, that it would be nice to see it more fully realized. Like a longer stage, or taking more advantage of that gimmick, but that combination honestly was interesting, and personally I do agree that those tile sets, while mismatched, did oddly work well together for this setup. So I think it can work, and definitely if this was a first attempt at a stage, honestly it's really good and probably better than most of what I could put together. I wouldn't have thought of using those mechanics together, but they worked really well, so keep at it. And next up we had 164th place, Temple of Light and Dark by Elysia Derene, 31.2 out of 100. This stage had 8 in design, 2.8 in fun, 6.2 in creativity, 6.4 in aesthetics, and 7.8 in functionality, with no time penalty. Mick, 33 out of 100. Oh, this level. This did not inspire positive feelings. The Temple of Light and Dark is basically 2 levels stitched together. They both have 2 routes, one short and one long, and they each have 2 tokens, one early and one late. Props for consistency, but both temples have very severe flaws. Not only are both of them confusing to navigate, but they're also chock full of hard-hitting enemies and spikes, more than the average Capcom water level. That alone is frustrating, but they're also both pretty long temples to boot, creating a downright draining experience. For specific problems, the Dark Temple Blackout is hard on the eyes, since we have jet black enemies against a very dark purple. I have to squint and lean forward to see them at all, and I already use glasses. For that matter, the Tomahawk platforms have a tendency to dump enemies into spikes, rendering them useless. The Light Temple gimmicks are Yokus and Force Beams, both of which have a penchant for brutalizing you at the slightest misstep. Yes, even with lasers 2-hit KOing you instead of killing you outright. While I appreciate the attempted consideration, dodging them is quite precise, and the checkpoints aren't merciful enough to prevent some tank chugging. I mean, I had to resort to it. Speaking of tank chugging, the bosses are a mess. Taking Darkman and Solarman, doubling their health and increasing their strength a bunch? Not the best idea. My blind run with Darkman was downright miserable, owing to his speed, his ability to kill me in 4 to 5 hits, and being a shield boss with 56 HP. And when I got to Solarman, I erased him with the water shield. I didn't have the patience at that point. The mini-bosses aren't nearly as bad as the end bosses, but they also don't seem to be implemented right, leading to desyncs or floating in the floor. Yeah, I did notice that the challenger from the future mid-boss was doing that, and I also still don't get why it was just invincible sometimes. I'm not as familiar with that game, so I don't know if that's how that mid-boss is supposed to work or not, and if so, what the tell is. The Anchor fight is the most doable of the 3 outright bosses, which is ironic considering he's the bonus boss of the Dark Temple. Still, as far as token challenges go, I prefer Anchor to the challenge for the late Light token. Killing a giant gorilla for a key, taking the key through a huge force beam gauntlet, 3 more highly deadly rooms where one mistake can kill you, and then you get the token. Completing this sequence from start to finish took nearly half an hour by itself, because of course I died a lot, which is too much for 1 token. As a whole, this level was frustrating. It has ambition and some creative ideas, but the execution leaves much to be desired. There was one section that I enjoyed though, the Dark Illusions with the Crystal Joes. This was the most interesting, and in my opinion fair, section of the level, and I really appreciated that Crystal Joe was allowed to be interesting. It's not much of the level, but there's something. I wish the rest of the level was more like that part. Shinryu, 24 out of 100. There's a lot to unpack with this one. First off, a good chunk of this level is a maze. Mazes in Metroid-styled levels have a very checkered past when it comes to the MagMammal series. I know there's plenty of people out there who enjoy these sorts of stages for how they mix up the gameplay, but I can't say I'm one of them. Personally, I just don't think these types of stages are suitable in the context of a level design contest like MagMammal. More often than not, they tend to take much longer to complete than a regular Mega Man stage, have harsh punishments for death, mainly thanks to odd checkpoint placement, and overall have too much trial and error thanks to an overabundance of winding and confusing pathways. Sadly, this particular level ends up ticking pretty much every single one of those boxes, plus a couple more. The stage itself is divided into 2 sections, light and dark. It doesn't matter which one you explore though, because both areas have their own share of problems. The light section has rooms that are packed to the brim with enemies in almost every corner, along with some incredibly frustrating sets of Yoku block puzzles. The one leading up to the diamond token has blocks that are just out of reach of your maximum jump height, meaning you need to clip on top of them to progress, assuming you're not just using utilities to bypass all this, all hail the magnet meme. However, by far the worst of these is the block puzzle in the long vertical room. Having Yoku spikes that spawn on top of the player as they're trying to work around this part is a cheap shot at best, since you're pretty much guaranteed to die unless you've memorized where all the spikes are beforehand. The dark section is a little more tolerable thanks to the lack of Yoku blocks, though not by much, seeing as it has sections with platforms and enemies that are barely visible. Going deeper into the stage eventually puts you on more linear paths for both sections, but they still have the same basic problems as the maze parts. Enemy placement that gives very little leeway for being hit, overly tight jumps where the punishment for failure is often instant death, and a severe lack of checkpoints. The lower light path is easily the worst of these, with rotating force beams that come out of nowhere. They definitely could have done with some better visual indicators, coupled with an overabundance of enemies that make this path far more hectic than it should be. Out of all of these sections, there was only one that I actually enjoyed, the Spotlight segment with the Crystal Joes. 2 out of 5. Having the enemy's projectiles along with your own shots reveal the stage's surroundings is a really neat idea, and one that I wish had a greater presence throughout the stage. It certainly feels like a better fit for the level's theme, more so than surprise Yoku spikes and rotating lasers, that's for sure. On that note, I can see where you're coming from in using Solar Man and Dark Man as the main bosses, but recoloring them and ramping up their damage output to absurd levels really didn't do their fights any favors. If anything, they just serve as an annoying climax to an almost all-around unenjoyable stage. Patchy, 32 out of 100. Ancient Domain of Illumination and Illusion. So right off the bat, there are branching paths, there are light and dark versions of the stage, and you need to switch between, and there are keys to find. Labyrinth-style stages can be hard to pull off right. Unfortunately, this is one that didn't cut it. A maze stage naturally means the player would be expected to explore through the same areas at least a few times before they have the layout mapped out in their head. The stage didn't really quite make this process a pleasant one due to multiple reasons. The enemies, consisting mostly of Mets and Joes, have a common theme of being shielded. The other half of the roster is various stationary turrets. With how most of these elements only serve to stop you from traversing too quickly, it overall ended up feeling more like padding than actually spicing up the challenge of each room. There are many instant death hazards, which means you lose all your keys really often from all the exploration you need to do while around the mazy layouts. While the keys are not mandatory for reaching any of the bosses, it still adds up to the frustration of repeated traversal needed to reach any of the side areas with collectibles. The side areas aren't necessarily a breeze in the park by themselves either. Checkpoints are few and far between, spelling disaster with the brutal and unforgiving platforming challenges. The Dark Temple in general is exceedingly difficult due to the inability to see or parse anything in the rooms. It doesn't help that in some rooms the platforms are outright hidden and only visible up close. The nail in the coffin, though, is that there exist fake ladders, which is just an absolutely mean design decision for what's already a really miserable section. I very much did not approve of this. Boss fights are not much better. They're basically normal engine default bosses, only given more health and maybe a speed or damage increase here and there. Kind of a lazy way to increase the difficulty of the fights for the sake of increasing the difficulty. It overall really doesn't lead to a satisfying conclusion to the stage. Flashman 85, 36 out of 100. Speaking from experience, mazes are difficult to do well. This might have worked as a puzzle level inspired by A Link to the Past or Metroid Prime 2, jumping between a light half and similar yet different dark half to reach the end. Instead, it's an exercise in memorizing two completely different level layouts full of branching paths, leading who knows where. Rules and expectations are thoroughly unclear. There's no obvious goal, too many paths, and zero warm-up for the challenges. Keys and key doors further complicate matters. Secrets are more likely to be stumbled on than sought out. There's no logic to how most are hidden. Light and dark are mostly interchangeable in terms of design, and they lack memorable landmarks to aid in navigation. Almost every room is saturated with enemies, often the same few types, in configurations that can't reasonably be overcome without taking damage or using special weapons. Some enemies aren't positioned properly, falling off platforms and into pits. There's an excessive amount of instant death for any level, let alone one involving so much backtracking. The bosses don't need multiple health bars. Downgrading to damage spikes, adding more checkpoints, allowing the player to see more of the Yoku block patterns before jumping in, and or requiring less precise jumps from the player would go a long way in making the current challenges more palatable without completely reworking them. On the plus side, the music sets a great tone for the level. The visuals are clean and easily distinguishable, even in the darkest rooms. Poking around is rewarded with super secret secrets. The choice of assets toward the end of the level reflects some deliberate theming, with lasers, laser-shooting flowers, and Solar Man contrasting nicely with a Mega Man 7 visibility gimmick, Shadow Clones, and Darkman. The level is at its best when it focuses on developing more linear challenges with these themed assets. Ace Spark, 31 out of 100. Oh boy, this is a stage that has lots of little moments dragging it down, but those moments are born from a very few clear and global problems throughout the stage. There are positives here. In terms of how the mechanic is handled and pulled off, the dual world scene in games like Link to the Past and Metroid Prime 2 is actually pulled over very well here. Rooms are familiar between the Light and Dark Temple, but with differences in enemy layouts and terrain to make them wildly different to play. I also think the general aesthetic and atmosphere fits. The actual tile set and method of tiling the level looks pretty good, and I appreciate that pits are clearly telegraphed, a very significant issue another certain exploration stage in MagMammal 2 failed to do. But the issues lie with the level design, not the theme. It is yet another Metroidvania-style stage that tries to have the player explore every nook and cranny for keys and navigate between the light and dark to get to one of the two bosses or tokens on the side paths. Unfortunately, it misses the fundamental gameplay that Metroidvania or explorations games relies on. The challenge should be in the exploration itself, and not in how the player executes their movement. The stage has an ungodly reliance on instant death or high damage challenges. Some challenges require pixel-perfect jumps, enemies deal heavy damage, and there are death spikes and pits everywhere. Certain challenges take almost as long to clear as entire main series Mega Man stages. The green token takes a whopping 2 minutes even using weapons to get. Two of the primary gimmicks are the worst offenders. Force beams might not be instant death, and the layouts combined with rotating force beams offer some decent and potentially fun timing challenges. Without background cues, rotating force beams are incredibly hard to parse. Oftentimes, players will take extreme damage even standing in locations that look safe, because the force beam clipped them for a nanosecond as it tries to figure out what it is and isn't blocking it. Yeah, I definitely had that problem. Yoku blocks are just a catastrophe here, with the entire challenge relying around surprise there's a spike you forgot was here. All this and a severe lack of checkpoints means the stage quickly becomes frustrating mere minutes in. Thankfully, certain challenges can be completely bypassed through use of Magnet Beam. All hail. The player is able to get into side passages and skip rooms entirely, but this is only a small bandage on lowering the difficulty. The enemy selection is also problematic. So many enemies are too defensive, further damaging any flow the level required to make exploration rewarding, and during the dark area it's even worse. In the dark areas, some enemies blend in so much it's almost impossible to see. I realize seeing how some of them are pure black, that is the point, but it's still irritating to get sideswiped by an enemy you didn't realize was there. Lastly, the bosses have an arbitrarily large health bar. This isn't a challenge, it's tiring. Weapon use and energy weapon tanks are the only thing making this stage even slightly playable, and that does not help in the long run. I consider myself a decent Mega Man player, and I'm having to rely on these things heavily here. I fear anyone else with lesser skill might never see the exits to the stages, let alone the tokens. So, yeah, I kinda stand by the one thing I could give it when I was talking about it in the actual gameplay video. This stage was ambitious. But I do feel like it maybe errs onto the side of too ambitious for its own good. The idea of the dark and light paths, it's a sound and interesting idea, but in truth they don't really interact with each other all that much. Like, I feel like I was pretty much able to just stay in one side or the other as long as I wanted to find whatever I was after at the time. I think it could have worked better pared down a bit. Like, something I was thinking of was, I think it's one of the planets in Kirby Superstar and Milky Way Wishes, that it's essentially one stage, but going through doors cycles you through seasons. It makes certain areas available and other areas get cut off, and you have to go through the seasons to find treasures or make progress in the stage. And I think implementing the Dark Temple, Light Temple gimmick here that way could have been a lot more interesting. And yeah, indicators on the Force Beam and just in general less reliance on instant death I think would have been very helpful and made things a lot more enjoyable. And I do have to agree that the bosses did not need extra health bars. For what it's worth, between the two, I will say I think I found the Dark Path overall more enjoyable. Though I can get what some of the judges were saying about enemies being almost impossible to see. I was able to see it well enough, and I do wear glasses, but I consider myself lucky in that. I can definitely see where it would have been problematic for people that don't have as good a vision, or that maybe their monitor settings are different. I can definitely see where it would have been a problem. But overall, an interesting idea that just needs more polish and paring down, I would say. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you're enjoying the series so far, and I shall see you again next time. Until then, fare thee well. Look, this thing has been hovering over me the whole time. Mice aren't magnetic.